Thank you for coming here today. I know the weather outside is awful, so we're glad that you made it here anyways. We had quite a few more people signed up, but as I said, due to the weather conditions, maybe some people were held up. So my name is Malin Stjernström. I work at the Swedish Development Forum, or FUF, as we're more commonly known as. And I will be guiding you through what we hope will be a very interesting afternoon. As you know, the title of the seminar is By Peaceful Means Supporting Conflict Resolution in Syria and Kashmir. And more specifically, we're here to learn about and to discuss dialogue as a tool for promoting peace in Syria and Kashmir. So this seminar is part of a series of seminars and a project run by FUF during this fall. And the project is aimed at spreading knowledge and increasing debates about peaceful methods to resolve and prevent armed conflicts. So the first seminar considered mediation, sanctions and civil resistance from quite an overall perspective. And the second seminar had a more specific theme. We met with two representatives from ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, sort of as an example of a successful peaceful movement and a campaign for a global ban on nuclear weapons. So for this third and last seminar of this series, our focus is on sort of practical examples. And we're happy to be joined here by two exciting guests, Tahir Aziz and Andrew Ladley. And Tahir Aziz is the South Asia Program Director at Conciliation Resources in London. And Conciliation Resources is an independent international organization that works with people in conflict to prevent violence, resolve conflicts, and promote peaceful societies. Tahir has previously worked as a senior associate with the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy in Washington, D.C., and before that he was director of the Human Rights Commission of the government of Pakistan. Today Tahir is here to talk about what the work that Conciliation Resources do in Kashmir. Among other things, they work to create opportunities for dialogue among diverse groups within Kashmir, such as youth, women, and business persons. But I'll let him tell you more about their work in a minute. Our other guest, Andrew Ladley, is a senior advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva, which is a private diplomacy organization that works to prevent, mitigate, and resolve armed conflict through dialogue and mediation. Andrew has been a senior advisor in various programs at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and worked in places such as Africa, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and most recently the Middle East. He's also served as a senior advisor with the United Nations standby team of expert mediators. A little later, Andrew will tell us about his organization's work in Syria, where they have been working discreetly with all parties to the conflict, facilitating dialogue and meetings, among other things. So the layout for this afternoon is that in a minute I will hand over to Tahir, who will give you a presentation for about half an hour, and I will ask him a couple of follow-up questions after that. Then you'll get a chance to refill your coffee and stretch your legs, and then we'll hand over to Andrew and he will give his presentation. And then we'll have a joint discussion, hopefully from a comparative perspective and with lots of questions from you who are here to listen. I will also say something about the use of all this technique that I'm talking in a microphone, even though it's a rather small room. It's because we are filming this event and live streaming it in our YouTube channel, and also making the film available after the seminar on our website. So now I would like to hand over to Tahir to let him share some of his knowledge about the conflict in Kashmir.
Well, thank you very much, Molly.
You're welcome to stand here if you like.
Yeah. Okay. Let me stand there. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Molin, and thank you to FOF for inviting me here today and having the company of our respected guests and experts is really something that I see with a great sense of privilege. I have a PowerPoint presentation also, but then I thought it might get a bit boring for you, so the idea was to just speak. But let me know if you would prefer something more visual. Then it is there, and I can set it up for you. Is that? Shall I just? Okay. Conciliation Resources has been introduced. Thank you, Marlon. It's a UK-based peace-building organization. Has been around for 22, 23 years now. We work in a number of regions, and Kashmir is one of those. And I'll focus on Kashmir. Now, whenever I have to speak about Kashmir, you know, the biggest sort of challenge to me is that it's either to me or in reality is kind of a quite a long-standing, historically speaking, geographically speaking, population-wise, you know, just regional kind of power dynamic and all that. It's just so complex and so big that it just becomes very difficult to speak in a way that is more succinct and simple and meaningful. So I will probably also struggle today, but let me try. Let me put the map up there so that shall I just click on the map or the next? Okay, just to see what we mean when we say Kashmir. As you can see, there is a line of control, the dotted line within this boundary, the red boundary, that divides the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir primarily between what is known as the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir on the right and, you know, south side of it, and on the west there is a strip of land, and on the top and corner is the northern areas. These are controlled by Pakistan, and there is another third nuclear power, China, that also has quite a significant land mass under its control, which was part of the princely state. It's Aksai Chin, and it's in the north and east. So you can see quite an interesting neighborhood. We have China, Pakistan, India, 3 nuclear powers surrounding Kashmir. But we also have, through northern areas of Pakistan, control Kashmir, linked to Afghanistan and Central Asia. So it gets more interesting. So Kashmir, just few things about it. It's like a 70 years old issue. It became a political issue a long time ago, but from 1947, when India and Pakistan became independent, it just emerged as a dispute, territorial dispute, based on the idea of division, based on the idea of self-determination within Kashmir, based on geopolitics and many other factors. But it became a dispute primarily between India and Pakistan, who each one of them claimed Kashmir, the full state of Jammu and Kashmir, as its part, and as you know, just on the basis of many reasons, geographical, religious, cultural, political. But there was a war that divided Kashmir between the two countries, 1947. The conflict has remained there, both between the two sides, two countries, but also internally between different parties. Fast forward 1971, there was another war between the two countries, but that also affected Kashmir. Prior to that, there was 65 war primarily on Kashmir, which didn't resolve the issue. There was a peace agreement after that. The peace agreement also couldn't sustain. Then 71, another war. There was another peace agreement, didn't resolve Kashmir. Then the kind of whole competition between the two sides remained intact. They became, one of the argument is that India and Pakistan almost became nuclear powers because of their rivalry over Kashmir. 1998, they declared explicitly that they are nuclear powers. But in 1999, there was another war on Kashmir, smaller one, which kind of became quite alarming because at that point there were nuclear powers and the world community was, more sort of worried at that point. It subsided, but the conflict remained there. The entire 70 years is a story of quite an intense conflict between the Pakistani and the Indian army. There have been peace overtures. The most significant of those was between 2003 and 2007-8, when they actually spelled out quite a kind of interesting way forward to deal with Kashmir, based on making the line of control as an irrelevant border. Very catchy phrase, very catchy idea, quite transformative, had lots of takers within both countries, within Kashmir, but somehow, and we don't know why, there are many reasons, including political chaos in Pakistan and also weak government in India, that these two countries couldn't, they say, some of the people who were involved in that say that they were just close to signing the final agreement, but it didn't happen. So that is just broadly the context. The competition, the conflict, the firing between the militaries from both sides continues along the line of control primarily. They have also declared a ceasefire since 2003, which often gets violated, but it is also something that they haven't explicitly withdrawn from. So the current situation is not much different. It's quite hostile. They sort of both countries find every opportunity for maligning the other and being competitive, sort of interesting. Now within Kashmir there are a lot of different groupings, but largely the relationship between the two sides along the line of control is not hostile. So there is not an internal fight between the two sides, as it was, which often gets kind of is a misperception that often gets raised. But that doesn't mean that there is a unified sort of nation within Kashmir. There is so much diversity, religious, regional, linguistic, cultural, and political, that Kashmir in itself, we're talking about a large territory, but also in terms of number of people, it's like I don't know what's the population of Sweden, but it's like it's about 120 million would be the total number of people. No, I think that's wrong, because 20 million, or 18 to 20 million would be the number. So but still a big number of people that get affected by this dispute, and they live in Pakistan. Some of them live as immigrants in the European countries, but mostly within the region. But anyway, so this background I thought was interesting, because what I'm going to now focus on is our peace sort of efforts there. And so this is what one has to be up against when we think about Kashmir. Now, as a small organization based in London, we thought what we could do best was to focus more on the agency of people from within Kashmir, because often, like I said, the conflict gets framed as a conflict between India and Pakistan, which it is, but it is not all about India and Pakistan. So any peace process, any negotiation process that has happened so far, primarily official, but also through unofficial track 2 and other means, has primarily focused between the sort of Indian and Pakistani diplomats and interlocutors to come together and talk about Kashmir, and that will have a mostly historically very tokenistic representation by Kashmiri people. So that has been the major thing. So what we thought about 10 years back, that we can perhaps fill some of that gap by working with people on both sides of the line of control to see what kind of complementary processes can emerge through that interaction, where possibility for a final kind of political negotiation could be more meaningful. And this has been, just something, exclusion of Kashmiri voices and opinion from a process was something that has been a consistent sort of demand by Kashmiris, and has been raised as that they are not on the negotiating table. They are not a party which is recognized. Now, first of all, there hasn't been a proper negotiation table most of the time, but whenever there was, it was quite for a very limited time between the two governments, and that was quite exclusively between Islamabad and New Delhi. But like I said, 2003 and 2007 provided some new ideas in terms of the inclination of two countries to think outside of the box, and that also allowed some civil society thinking on Kashmir to look for some alternative, new creative solutions to that. And so hence this idea about making the line of control more humane and more accessible for Kashmiris as an kind of an interim way for bringing transformation to the region without necessarily giving up on the sovereignty question, or just dealing with in a more creative way, was very creative approach. So that just provided some opportunity and for people, and we thought that window of opportunity was something that needed to be practically expanded. And what I mean by that is that the governments often, and this is our experience, that they often can, it's very hard for them to, it has been very hard for them to agree to anything so far, but whenever they agreed, it was like they would agree and then leave it there. So I think there is a structural problem. I don't think it's only specific to Kashmir or India and Pakistan, that governments, until and unless they are fully sort of convinced and transformed and have a kind of a paradigm shift in their thinking, they will find it very hard to practically sort of demonstrate the implementation of their, even if they agree on something. So for example, in this case, there were some confidence building measures that were announced to allow the idea of making the line of control a bit porous and accessible. So they announced travel for the divided people in Kashmir in 2005, and in 2008 they also allowed a limited trade process to happen. But our learning was that that was like just a CBM announced, which facilitated some bureaucratic processes to take place and include a bus service or a truck service to start. But beyond that, it was like complete control and hostility and all that kind of thing was still there. So the space that God created was requiring somebody to just take that to public level, to promote, to include people in terms of realizing and making that confidence building process kind of a reality and a meaningful thing for them to. And it's difficult, it's not that straightforward, in the absence of a kind of a political agreement. Just a smaller step towards something often means people get confused. People say, is this it? Is this all? We've been fighting for a bigger political resolution, and all we get is an announcement that some trade points and travel points will be open. So what happens more often, it just becomes something insignificant because there is no way for government to move beyond that, because they don't want to lose their political capital, and because it's kind of an interstate conflict, there is always a zero-sum kind of understanding attached to it. Whatever India concedes is Pakistan's gain, and vice versa. So that is the dynamic that we saw in Kashmir. Now, in order for that thing to make it more relevant, and of course, it goes without saying that within Kashmir there is kind of a reflection of that political dispute and exclusion of such incremental processes from something being meaningful. So we thought that involving civil society, and by civil society we mean the people who are concerned about Kashmir in the daily life that they live, as academics, as journalists, as economists, as business people, but also the political actors from different parties. They were the main kind of partners in this process with us, and we started working on both sides. And I think I would categorize our approach in terms of three sort of interrelated, interlinked strands or axes or processes. One is that we worked with a lot of those people to expand the opportunity for an internal dialogue within Kashmir on either side, across many divisions, across many regions, many ethnic, political, and over time. So that has happened quite significantly in many regions, between many regions, and within many regions. And the idea was primarily that in the absence of an official peace process, and in the absence of even a possibility for Kashmiris to be recognized as a kind of a party to the negotiations, what other forms of participation could there be which allow people to talk about their aspirations, their issues, and at least understand? So it's that was one thing. And the second thing is that while you go through that process of internal dialogue, most of those things and the complexity around those things also becomes quite known. Otherwise it's like a quite hard position that within Kashmir people had, and they wanted to say that, or they wanted that demand to be met. but the dialogue process allowed people to kind of nuance things and articulate and understand that it's not that simple. It's not that, just them versus India or them versus Pakistan, or it's just so that has been a consistent process that we have been supporting. Of course, in one of the challenge there is that it does not necessarily resolve the bigger political issue, and people get often quite just disappointed with the fact that dialogue in itself does not produce the final outcome. But I think largely it has been a form for people to come back to the discussion place, because alternatives to those things were also not feasible, not meaningful, including the violence that often erupts. And once they see that, they kind of see the value that at least sort of expanding those spaces within their own community is far more better than just doing nothing, or just being sort of overwhelmed with this thinking that nothing is possible. So that's one element. The other thing that we focused on and we did was the cross line of control communication through practical things, through trade and the business community's involvement in that, in terms of kind of providing a institutional kind of arrangement to sustain that relationship. So there is a joint chamber of commerce and industry that came into existence through this process, and it continues to be a forum that has membership, legitimacy, relationship, and kind of a working arrangement between all these regions across the divide. And it's quite a creative thing that emerged as a civic idea, because it wasn't possible for governments to do that, because it challenges sovereignty, it challenges everything. So the only institution which exists between the two sides is this joint chamber of commerce and industry, and it's quite something that people from very different diverse political opinions within that community want to retain, irrespective of their difference of opinion in terms of the final outcome of the political dispute. They think that this is useful, and over time governments in Delhi and Islamabad also saw that as a transformative idea. So they haven't created any problems for that. They said, well, this is something that we never thought would be possible. It's useful. And similar ideas about many other collaborations between the two sides on joint tourism, on joint disaster management, on looking at universities. I mean, these might seem very normal ideas here, but in the Kashmir divide, people didn't have this opportunity of interacting or knowing the other side for a very long time. So quite a significant amount of thinking and transformation needs to happen to actually believe in these things, that these are possible and people can think about. So that is another area. And the final thing, the third thing, is the political kind of dialogue process that we gradually facilitated, and after having all sort of other things emerge gradually, and that is primarily between the Kashmiri people from both sides, and it is something that the members of that dialogue process have different political other orientations, but they've come under one platform known as Kashmir Initiative Group. And the idea is not to find a sort of best solution to Kashmir. The idea is to see what incremental steps could be taken, and what could be done to avoid the exclusive politics, and how the politically diverse opinions can be brought under one roof to talk about that within Kashmir. So that has gradually allowed people to come under sort of on a platform where, I mean, even in the 70 years of Kashmir's history, that hasn't been possible, that you will have somebody from the extreme opposite parties come and sit. They didn't agree on, just one solution or something, but the mere fact that they have been able to to negotiate things is in itself is. But that beyond Kashmir also facilitates a process between quite senior, almost track 1.5 kind of level people from India and Pakistan. So the approach that the two countries would talk and there will be some reference or presence of Kashmir was the norm. Now through this process, the Kashmiris are the internal facilitators who have completely, the more legitimacy and relationship to drive that process. So that I would think as a kind of a creativity that has been possible through this. Now there are bigger other factors that continue to hamper things, but just a few things on where it could lead or something. Very difficult to assess things precisely, but there is some signaling in New Delhi. They have appointed a new interlocutor after a very long time. So the government officially has appointed an interlocutor to talk to Kashmiris. At the moment it's limited on their side, but this has been a process where things have in the past moved and taken some momentum. So there is some hope, limited hope, that this can be something that again in the same manner, that it's not necessarily, the governments will not necessarily be able to go all the way along. So some civil society, some peace building support will need to be accompany this and create this into something. So that's what we are trying to capitalize on. The second thing is the elections in Pakistan are due next year, and also in India in 2019, and so that's in a way indicates a possibility that in the coming year or so there will be hopefully governments in place who will have at least 4 or 5 years just in the horizon. And because things militarily haven't worked so far, so things have been contained so far, but that doesn't mean the governments are thinking that their sort of military approach and dialogue, running away from dialogue and engagement has actually worked. So there is this realization that things on Kashmir, the conflict has actually escalated. Human rights, violence has increased over the past few years. All indicators that the kind of agitation and turmoil, and I'm sure you read newspapers sometimes, those stories make news. That has also increased over the past few years quite significantly. Primarily on the Indian side, but overall between the two sides, it has also not worked. So again, with a lot of caution and all that, the hope is that there is this now. There usually is fatigue with the dialogue and all that, but there is now fatigue with the military approach as well, that it also doesn't work. It just keeps on creating more and more problem. It just just increases the conflict, and there is a significant new dynamic in South Asia between India and Pakistan, which is the increased onslaught I would say, economic onslaught at the moment of China. And it's just shifting things on a very massive scale, the power balance. And I think there is this apprehension that things could have been probably set right at a different level at point, and they're losing time on that, and there will be new elements, and this is what happens, I think, with conflict. You leave it to fester, and people would think it just will go away. It just creates new ways of emerging, and so what was relevant in 1947, probably some of it is still relevant, but there are so many new elements that have emerged in Kashmir. So I think that is another realization that probably puts pressure on both sides to be more serious. One last thing is that their national security advisors, it's a very discreet process. It's not it's back channel, very discreet, but most of the people would argue that they have been in constant contact even during this whole time. So that's kind of a positive thing. They haven't come up with something good so far, but at least the contact has been there. So what used to be an pronounced back channel between India and Pakistan has, over the past 4 or 5 years, has been quite sort of discreet, but between the national security advisors as opposed to the diplomats, which was the case in the past. But the fact that it is there is a hope that appointment of the interlocutor, appointment of the process that continues, and the new dispensations would open up an opportunity for something meaningful to happen. And in that case, I think coming back to the preparation and the ownership and a changed thinking within Kashmir, and some of the Indians and Pakistanis on that, around the ideas of participation, around the possibility of a political negotiation being something that can transform things. It doesn't have to be exclusive, and the thinking that military approaches, no matter whatever extent you go to, as an angry young person getting involved in violence, or somebody being very nationalistic and supporting your military, there are different reasons for that kind of thinking to emerge, and that hasn't gone. But I think the counter argument and narrative getting stronger in that case would hopefully be something that would be useful in terms of this change scenario. But that's what is a long-standing engagement for us, and so we're trying to persuade.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I need to stand over here because this
Sure.
microphone it's not wireless.
So where did I?
So I wanted to. I have so many questions, but I wanted to start with the one that I asked you before the seminar started, about the willingness of people in Kashmir to participate in these dialogue initiatives. Is there a willingness, or is a great part of your work to bring about that willingness in people?
I would say it's both. And the willingness exists independent of our work, but it fluctuates. It goes to different sort of extremes. Sometimes people would argue that as long as Kashmiri aspiration of Kashmiris is considered, and they are recognized as legitimate party to the conflict, they are happy to negotiate and be part of the dialogue. So they are not, throughout this period, if you look at the party position, Kashmiris have been consistently arguing for dialogue. Even the most extreme people who say they can't compromise on their ultimate political goal, but they still say they are ready to have a dialogue. But of course, they are the weakest party here. So the dialogue, they say that. But at the same time, I think it is also true that the conflict often gets violent, and which means there is violence on the streets, there is violence across the line of control, and it's very interesting question as to determine who initiated that and all that. And it's not, again, Kashmir is not the only place where that happens, but that violence often leads to, most of the time it leads to more extreme positions. And one of the position is that until and unless certain condition is met, APSC, All Parties Hurriyat Conference, which is the umbrella organization for the separatist camp, they would say until and unless India agrees to an unconditional kind of dialogue, which means that it has to be outside of the Indian constitution, they say they're not ready to have any dialogue with that. And now civil society hasn't come up with saying, you know, APSC is wrong and India is right, or India is wrong, or that. But more often, through the work that we have done and others have done, you see a lot of support, a consistent support. And the difference is the consistency, even in terms of in the times where there is extreme violence, or in times where there is relative calmness. A consistent, increased voice saying there is no other way. Dialogue is the only option. That is how this thing will be politically resolved. Otherwise, you know, we are just we have spent 70 years fighting, we will spend another 70 years fighting. It's not going to work. So the constituency, I would say, of people arguing for dialogue rather than making it more conditional is increasing. So that's quite encouraging, and often it just means that you are often confronted with situations where your own people, on Kashmiri political actors, would see that as quite a dangerous kind of a thought, but it has over time kind of given people, including the people who have been involved in militancy in the past. So this trade process that I mentioned, most of the actual traders are from the former combatants who were like involved in, and because the nature of that conflict has divided them, and they would move from the Indian side to the Pakistani side, and then were very engaged in that. The divided sort of family nature of that allows them to do that trade, because it's kind of a barter trade. It's not a financial transaction that they can do. So you can only get involved in that if you know the person on the other side, you can trust them, or you can barter with them, rather than having a kind of a guarantee that your payment will be made or something. So that's why it has persuaded, and it has, despite all the control and all securitization and all that, it has survived and increased and included many other people over time. So there was a recent study that suggests that between 2008 and 15, ever since they started, just 7 years, in international standards, nothing, but it's about $700 million worth of trade that has happened just between those two tiny kind of parts, and on a sort of a barter level. So this speaks of the huge kind of intent that has over time. I mean, it wasn't there. It was like this idea was also not there. So you're responding to your question, does it, is it a product of peace building efforts? I would say yes, largely it is true. But also the fact that there is no such huge hostility between the two sides as such also means that Kashmiris have always been, since the beginning, been marginalized. So they would, as a weaker party, also would say, let's have dialogue, let's have political negotiations. So that was the...
Well, this is quite encouraging to hear. But then I would like to ask you about, or ask you to talk a bit more about the connections between the informal and the formal processes. Sort of the connections between the dialogue that civil society is part of and the political process between the governments.
I think it's I would say it's largely informal, still very informal, but because of the kind of a long association with this process and the establishment of trust and relationship between the civil society, some of the actors within our process involved at facilitating and being sort of promoting this dialogue, and also the government actors and the policy makers at highest level. That's how it's quite an interesting way of influencing and keeping sort of informed, because that those two levels of I mean, there is no official dialogue as such at the moment happening, and the only one is quite sort of secret, the NSA's one, but the policy decisions vis-a-vis Kashmir, based in Delhi or in Pakistan, the people who are responsible for that, and the people who are national security people, who are in sort of Prime Minister's office, who are in the Ministry of Home Affairs or in the Foreign Affairs, and they are informed, and they kind of quite sort of sometimes positively engage with this, thinking that in the absence of the official dialogue process, what this process is bringing to the table, because it's in fact doing something that the governments, until and unless they officially announce that, and for that God knows how many more things will have to change, but this process is in fact sort of in a microcosmic way doing what the official process would look like. What is the table, what is the negotiation about. And one of the things that we have found very useful is that in Kashmir's case, like I said in the beginning, the biggest problem is that there is no defined process and identified issues. So even if you bring parties to the table, you don't know what you're talking about, as opposed to the other processes. For example, in the Middle East, you at least have a kind of a history of saying, oh, you have this as agenda items, or these are the 4 things that we have to do. You often, in Kashmir's case, and this was also between India and Pakistan, often it was difficult to say, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about sovereignty? Are we talking about this? So there will always be debate about those things. So what we have tried to do, that this is the responsibility of people who are talking about peace, that they also bring some clarity as to what the issues are, and what are the, so setting kind of without being too directive, establishing kind of a clear agenda that could be transformative or something. So in that sense, I think that's also a way to interact with the governments and say, them finding that useful, that yes, this is something meaningful, because they can't do that.
Thank you. I think we'll take a quick break now, just 2-3 minutes to stretch your legs and refill your coffees.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tahir. Oh, you turn it off. Then it's fine. short amount of time.
Short amount of
Yeah.
I don't know. It was.
No, but we will have like a discussion with both you and Andrew at the end. So I mean, we'll
But time-wise, was I was in at some point. I was okay. Or?
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
You're okay. I think that is yours, but this is mine. Yeah, that's yours.
Wow. Because I couldn't get on the internet.
Let's see.
You can either just Google conflict map of Syria or Google Institute for the Study of War. So it would be fully just Google conflict map of Syria because it's a good idea.
No, it's fine. Thanks.
The new stuff and new stuff, and it's almost not used to it. You rust to even that detail this comes from, which requires the history, and then to give them some sense of how hard it is to build a certain conflict. See, this is how this is one of the world's longest standing, most practical issues, which is number 4. So that's one possibility. It doesn't look particularly pretty, and there's too many bits in it. But,
Okay. Shall I look at another one then?
Let's see if we can find another.
Perhaps I could try the other one you said.
Institute for the Study of War. Syrian conflict.
Understandingwar.org.
Yeah, that's it. And let's see if we can just look for Syria, or just look for latest to see if we just release. I just put Syria, Syria new ministry for somewhere there.
I have to see to some search
they'll be filming. If I do something like this, people will be able to see it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We want to do like a really zoomed in.
Okay, good afternoon to you, or good evening. Thank you for having me. The Center for Humanitarian Dialogue was originally part of the ICRC and was formed primarily to try to assist in conflict issues where parties appear to have issues that they might be able to sort out, but a mediator couldn't get to them all in conflict issues. The center broke off because that was too political, even as a separate organization, and has been functioning as a separate Swiss-based foundation, primarily trying to reach parties who can't be reached, but also in any sphere to try to assist with conflict questions. It's the oldest and the biggest one of these groups that works in sort of private sphere. It tries to support the UN and any other process that's around, or it just tries to conduct mediation on its own. So I thought I would, focusing on Syria, I thought I would just cover 3 points for you and invite you to think about this field of trying to find a way out of conflict, and think about Syria. The 3 points are: first, what's the objective of trying to find a way out of conflict? What's the objective? Seems a very simple question, but I'll explain. How does the society, the actors, and those that are trying to help, how do they go about it? What are the techniques that you use? What's the craft of getting involved in this field? Second point. And then thirdly, Syria. Why is this complicated, and why is it taking so long? Bit like the previous discussion we had on Kashmir, this is a very tough issue, and I'll explain why. So first of all, what's the objective? I invite you just to think of an extremely simple graph, if you would. On this axis we put peaceful means, and on this axis violent means. And in a war, by definition, you're somewhere around here, and after centuries and centuries you might get Sweden or Denmark, and you'll end up here, relatively little force, large amounts of political and social rules and systems for dealing with competition. So your goal is to go up this way, and of course it's not a straight line. Sometimes you can reduce the war but not really build much agreement as to exactly what's going to happen. Kashmir very substantially reduced the primary conflict between the major forces, but then they get other forms of conflict that develop, as we've been hearing in our previous discussion. And so your question is try to climb up this vertical axis, and you do that by what I call social contracting. In other words, by getting agreements. Some of those agreements might be big ones, the Constitution, a peace agreement. Some of them might be much smaller agreements. They are social contracts where people agree to solve their problems up that vertical axis by agreements and by rules, not by fighting. They might be exchanges of goods and services, prices. That's a social contract. In one of the key objectives is to get as many of those as possible that rebuild the sense that we can solve our problems, not just by shooting the person, but by getting an agreement from them. That sounds very obvious, but the key goal of mediators is therefore, the key goal of mediators is to try to pull the parties back up this vertical axis. And it's the key goal of the parties themselves. And the number of agreements you might reach might be many in terms of building relationships between groups that were broken. And in Syria or in places like Lebanon, Libya, there have been such a fragmentation, Yemen, such a fragmentation of the society that you need multiple agreements to pull back the society and the fabric so that it can hold rather than just have force. So that's the objective. You're gradually trying to assist the parties to build the social contract again. It's been broken, and by definition, when people are using force, relationships are damaged, things are hurt. That's obvious when you think of the big picture. So Europe, Second World War, major possibilities of Europe, First World War, try to build a social contract, League of Nations, try to build a set of rules, didn't hold. Second World War, let's do it again. Built the United Nations, and the core part of the United Nations says, let's not do this again. So it's the classic example of climbing up that hypotenuse, if you like, trying to climb the vertical axis. That's a big picture. And peace agreements are big pictures of those. But peace agreements often aren't enough when the society is broken. And those kind of relationships need to be repaired. So what's been described in our previous speaker is an attempt to do exactly that. In Kashmir, an attempt to try to find relationships, get people talking, do cross-border commerce. There's discussions that happen between security officials, mostly not known, but can you ever get enough political agreements such that you can stitch together again that social fabric? It's not clear. That takes me to point number 2. So point number 1 then, what's the purpose? The purpose is to try to assist the parties to rebuild a series of social contracts, some of which might be peace agreements, but all of which help. The second then, how do you go about that? What's the technique? What's the craft? What's the mechanism that you use? Now, all of that really requires you, it's obvious, to understand the drivers and the key decision makers. If it's an agreement that you need, who's going to agree? And can they? Can they agree? What's going to be the agenda? So you need to understand the decision makers, the sources of the conflict, the history. You need to understand what it is that's going to incentivize people to keep the situation as it is. Kashmir's been like that for 40, 70 years. People get used to it. Moving somebody away from a present situation requires a lot of energy. It's a core law of physics. You know, if you want to change something, it requires energy to move them there. So you have to understand what it is that's going to move the parties from a long established conflict. And the longer it goes on, the more people develop mechanisms for getting gains and so on from it, and you get the so-called spoilers, the people who are going to resist any attempt to build these agreements. So the first point of the craft is to properly understand the situation. That requires research, cultural background, history, and quite a lot of little eye intelligence about understanding the actors. Who are they? What motivates them? And so on. In mediation, you only have consent in the kind of work that we do. You need people to say, yep, I'll do that. And that requires you to understand what drives them, and it requires them to trust you, and it requires you to work closely with them. And if they say, no, you're just irrelevant, just gone. And we saw an example of it yesterday in the Syria talks, which I'll come back to, of where the government of Syria released a document taken inside the negotiation, not the negotiation, but the discussions. And they did it for a purpose. Their purpose was to say, we don't like what's going on. But consent, then. It's the craft of finding consent. Understanding is the key. And then there's a whole range of techniques by which you build the trust of the parties, and you gradually work with them to say, how far do you want to go in this regard? And many of them say, what's the point? And this is my last point underneath this second one, is what's your theory of change? In other words, what if we do this, then what? What's going to lead, how is A going to lead to B, and B going to lead to C, and then what? And a lot of the time the parties want that explained as best as possible. They don't expect miracles, because very often they're much more realistic than mediators, who can be very optimistic. But they do expect a frank discussion of what the process might work, and what the theory is. How might this go? That's much more complicated than it sounds. It's very common sense. You must come up and say, if these parties can talk to those people and reach an agreement about X, that might help us develop a bus route between these two communities. If the bus route goes there, you might need goods and services. That might reduce the checkpoints. The checkpoints going down will mean that trade can flow a bit more. Trade flowing a bit more will mean that people start getting invested in not shooting as buses go along that trade route. That's the kind of theory of change that you build at a local level, where they say, what are we doing? Why are you asking us to talk about these checkpoints? At a national level, this is also extremely hard. Who are the parties? Because we think of conflicts involving, kind of an identifiable soldier, an identifiable combatant. Actually, whoever is pulling it may be completely different, especially as we'll see in relation to Syria. It's not clear that if you get all the Syrians involved in the conflict, that they can actually solve it, because the people who are pulling and paying and funding and so on are not necessarily there in the room. So that's the second point. Why are we doing this? Social contracting. How are we doing it? That's a whole field of intervening with consent, with permission, if people allow you, and on a good day you might produce a theory of change that might be able to help. It's a very humbling business, not because everybody in this field are necessarily born humble. It's because the field humbles you, because you have so many times that you can think you can see a way forward, but you can't get there, the parties aren't ready, and so that's the craft. The third heading for you is Syria. And here I thought I would try to take you through this in quite big steps, but if you don't mind, since the end of 2017, we'll do it very largely in years. But the very quick prehistory, of course, is that breaking off from the Ottoman Empire becomes, end of the First World War, becomes part of a French-mandated territory, becomes independent, and then goes through a series of military governments, one of which gets more successful than the others and hangs on, and then hands power to his son as the successor, basically, current president. Syria in 45 seconds. And then the Arab uprising of 2011, the events in Tunisia, followed extremely quickly by Egypt. And suddenly the region is aflame with the possibility that the citizens might actually claim back government. And you know, all the analysts have basically said you have sort of democracy movements in Latin America, and you have democracy movements in Asia, and Middle East just doesn't seem to do democracy movements, and let's just sort of leave that aside. There's a sort of form of authoritarian government which appears to be stable, and it's going to be there forever. So this takes everybody by surprise, as you know, including the citizens and most of the rulers. And then you get that period of dramatic change where the previous social contracts have gone, and then the question of can they be rebuilt, and who's going to rebuild them? Who's going to rebuild the constitution of Tunisia with the rulers gone? Who's going to rebuild Libya? You know, where Libya functions without a constitution, just with a form of personal government since Gaddafi took over. Almost no state institutions that function in the ordinary way we do it. Almost no NGOs, no social institutions. The tribes have been squashed. Who's going to rebuild the social contract in Libya? When you try to climb up my graph from war in Libya, and you try and imagine the steps of going up that hypotenuse, who's going to do that? And how they're going to do it? Syria's particular contribution to that, the street protest, suddenly saying, no, we think that we can do it too here. In 2011, Egypt appears to have gone and suddenly changed. Syria tries. Lebanon tries. And the government does what governments in that part of the world do, which is to try to squash it. And had that simply been left, it would have been a rebellion that was failed, and a few thousand people would have been killed, and it would be terrible. In fact, it was become much worse than terrible, as you all know, because arms started flooding in from all the neighbors and from others who said, here's the opportunity to replace this particular government that had managed to hang on as a result of the first 30 seconds of Syria's history that I was mentioning, as part of its the consolidation of a military-backed Ba'athist power, and they managed to hang on. And so we moved from rebellion and riots. No, sorry, we moved from riots to rebellion, and from a protest for a democratic movement to a civil war. 2011. 2012, UN comes in and says, let's see if we can't get an agreement, and produces, with international support, something called the Geneva Communique, as a sort of core document which says, in order to do this, let's have a social contract rebuild right at the top. We have a peace agreement which says, basically, the government's going to hand over to some kind of transitional body, and then that'll bring peace. The Syrian government is not asked to consent to this. This was an agreement between the internationals who say we can produce our own form of social contract up here, you know, without the parties, and we'll give it to you, and that will settle the conflict. It doesn't. 2012 and 13, it becomes a full-scale civil war. 2014, it suddenly moves from a civil war.
Sorry, I'll just...
Oh, this is my map. It moves from a civil war into something that we have just never seen before, which is the one part of the civil war starts mobilizing against all other parts and building an entirely new terrorist movement on the scale of which we've never seen before, which is ISIS. 2014 takes over much of central Syria and in the east and much of northern Iraq, and suddenly we have this astonishing phenomenon that's come out of the Syria conflict, and obviously previously out of what had happened in Iraq a few years before. 2014, we don't have now a rebellion. We don't have a kind of some kind of attempt to build a democratic society. We've got something entirely different added to that mix. It's no longer one conflict, it's at least two major conflicts, and suddenly we realize there's a third. The third big conflict that appears to be around is that the Kurds in Turkey have been for decades trying to argue for some form of self-government, and we suddenly see a very significant rise of ISIS trying to squash the Kurds, and the Americans say, no, that's a step too far, and come in and back the Kurds. And we suddenly see the Kurds, backed by the Americans, becoming another major battle in this eastern part of Syria. Here, the bit that's currently purple. That succeeds beyond the Kurds' wildest dreams and takes over about a third of Syria, the purple part up on the map. The rebellion, meantime, backed by all of its components across 2015, reaches its peak. Russia intervenes, and then it starts retreating. The rebellion is starting to get squashed. Nothing on the ground can compete with air power of the nature that Russia was able to deploy, backed by Iran and other forces. The rebellion gets smaller and smaller, having at one point also been somewhere a third, maybe a bit more of Syria, is now in basically these four main yellow areas: the south, one close to Damascus, one in northern Homs, and that northwestern bit called Idlib. That's the rebellion. Across 2016, we see a revived peace process. Geneva becomes the centerpiece. The international community says again, let's produce an international settlement of the same nature that we saw in 2012. Based upon the Geneva Communique, there will be a transitional government. And the Russians say, let's see if we can't stop the war too. And they set up a parallel process, now currently known as the Astana process, where it says, this is going to provide ceasefires. Ceasefires, also called de-escalation zones. These are the four, the yellow ones, primarily yellow ones in the west of Syria. That will de-escalate the conflict, and then what? It's kind of like the conflict's de-escalated, and everybody's watching saying, and then what's the next step? And the next step was supposed to be in Geneva, and it's important next steps this week as we're speaking. A few weeks ago, the UN Special Envoy announced, we're meeting in Geneva, we're ready, come ready to negotiate. So everything is framed as if there is an attempt to rebuild Syria from the top down in this formula. But here's the question, we go back to our first 2 points. Whose consent do you need? What's the core objective of building this? And you need the consent of the government, who's now dominant and winning. ISIS has largely been destroyed. The Kurds are very largely near. The Kurds are not in Geneva at all. They're not allowed to be because Turkey fears that they're connected to the PKK and doesn't want them represented. The opposition are there, but the war is now completely contained, and the government's saying, should we really do a deal with people who we've squashed, and what kind of deal will it be, and why is it going to be a deal based upon their 2012 document? What kind of negotiation is this going to be? In the meantime, the country's bankrupt. I mean, it's been propped up by international forces, by Russia and by Iran, and by a range of militia groups, as we know, Hezbollah and a range of others. So we go back to the basics of this craft. Is it possible to rebuild the social contract in Syria, and who's going to do it and at what level? If you think of the ISIS domination, which at one point was much of that eastern part, including the sort of core fertile river valleys and oil fields of Syria. ISIS defeated, Imagine how shattered are those local communities after 2-3 years of being governed by this organization. If the opposition is to reach an agreement, how's it going to step back into a relationship with its neighbors, with their neighbors, and with the government of Syria, which says, let's move from war and let's climb up the hypotenuse, climb up that vertical axis. Let's build some political mechanisms of dealing with this, which aren't about punishment, imprisonment, bombings of your areas, but which are about saying we want to end the war. Are they ready to do that? Organizations at multiple levels are trying to work with communities to try and build the social contracts there and hope that they will be able to function together. It's going to be a long process. Syrians say we know how to live with each other and we can do that as long as we aren't frightened. Syrians say we can do this. Of course the social contract's been shattered, but the primary shattering is political. On a social level, we know each other. We can get on. This is not hard. At a social level, so everybody who fears this huge sectarian division, Syrians say we can do this. But at a political level, and from that, the war has driven such deep anger in terms of the determination to get punishment for rebellion and to get punishment for all the killing, all the bombings of civilians, such a lot of anger at the moment, that climbing your way back up that hypotenuse and getting people to agree at the top, it's going to be a very difficult process. The Syrian government and the Syrian opposition have never had one discussion between them. All the discussions that have happened in the last few years have been separate rooms with the UN, because they can't at the moment even be in one room in terms of all of that. So from a mediation point of view, the UN has got this. We have the process, they're all here, and yet we're seeing nothing coming out of it. So what's the theory of change? The theory of change is that at some point the parties will be ready. And until then we have to keep the room ready. We have to make it available. We have to make small progress. And let's see if we can't gradually build an understanding and get closer and closer. That's the theory of change. It's a very thin, for people who live up in the north, it's the first ice across the stream that you later hope to be able to ice skate on, but it's only the first, and it's not very thick. And if you put your foot down too heavily on that thin theory of change, it's going to go. And so who's driving this from the international community so far? Russia. Russia appears to say we intervene militarily, we're going to try and help the parties to settle. But are they ready? Are they going to climb up that hypotenuse? Are they going to try to rebuild the social contract at the top level? Syria looks paused. The war has mostly ended in the east. The war is paused in the west. The parties are assembled, and yet it's stuck. It's completely stuck. And the example that I mentioned that I would come back to was a film that was taken of and put on the internet of the Syrian delegation pointing to a map, and the caption and the commentary was Syrian delegation schools the special envoy on basic matters relating. Now, this is a very big put down to take a confidential negotiation and put something like that. It's on the internet, and and it was released. It's an attempt by the government to say we're not really happy with this process going on. So those talks, I think, are supposed to end today or tomorrow. We'll see an announcement. Like all of us, we live in eternal optimism. It would be wonderful if today, notwithstanding this video yesterday, a breakthrough came and the Syrian parties say that they will begin face-to-face negotiations, and they will start climbing up towards a peaceful set of rules which say let's end this terrible, terrible conflict. So we've had 2 years of that, 2016, 2017. The year ends now with a sense that Syria really does appear to be ready to do something quite dramatic. But can it? And is the technique there? Is the craft there? Are the parties ready? Very often in wars, and this was true of Sri Lanka, there were so many attempts to get an agreement in that civil war. They weren't taken until finally the government just said, right, I'm just going to impose what is now known as the Grozny solution, which is I'm going to bomb this place to pieces, and then we'll rebuild the social contract like we'll rebuild a city from rubble, and we'll gradually build a set of rules, but there will be rules that we impose and buildings that we build, and they aren't going to rely upon your opposition anymore. That's what's happened in some parts of this conflict, in Aleppo and others, cities completely flattened. And Syrians, bit by bit, are starting to say in there, can we rebuild our lives? It's just worth just refocusing again on the figures. I mean, more than half of Syrians have been pushed out of their homes and are on the run in temporary accommodation. It's more than half the population. And about a third, maybe a bit more, of the population is out the country. And refugees, including here. And the question is, what kind of a social contract do you need before they'll go back? In other words, on my little diagram here, forgive me, it's not my best art. If the war is here, if you can push the war back, but not really build a safe society and a set of rules, but just stop the war, is that going to be enough? I was thinking, it's okay, we've stopped the war, let's go home. We don't care about politics. Or do you have to go quite a long way up here to create a society where it's predictable, where people know the rules, where they aren't going to get imprisoned because they didn't do military service, where the punishment will stop? It's not clear to me at the moment that the process can climb much up here, that the parties are ready. But it is the ambition of mediators, and it's the ambition of everyone who works for a more peaceful world. The lesson for us in Western Europe, I'm from New Zealand, but I claim that here just for this discussion, is that if you go too far along here in terms of conflict, this process has to be maintained, held, and believed in, and it's the process of climbing back up here is what will hold your society together. But it often requires lots and lots of defenders and people to hold that climb up there. And in Syria, it does appear at the moment that parties are, certainly the government, is more anxious in winning than it is in climbing up here. And so I'm nervous about the future at the same time as I'm very optimistic. We try to contribute, but 500,000, maybe 600,000 Syrians, maybe somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people imprisoned who we may never see again. Nobody knows what the numbers are. It's a pretty big conflict to have happened, and maybe half the population displaced. This has happened in 6-7 years, and let's hope that we can contribute in some way to ending it. Thank you. Just a couple of things about this map before. That was my talk, but all I wanted to say is that Turkey, one thing that isn't clear about that is that Turkey intervened in that dark green area, and I didn't mention that, which is in order to stop the purple spread. And so Turkey maintains quite a substantial hold in that area. And it's currently, of course, one of the most peaceful and one of the most prosperous areas, because Turkey's pouring resources into stabilizing it. So that the part of that is it's just part of the mosaic that Syrians worry that their country might be breaking up into different colors that are going to hold like that for quite a long time under the influence of different parties. But of course the ambition is to bring it together in one united Syria.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation, Andrew. I wanted to get back to something more practical. And when I was reading about your work, the work that the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue does, it says that you work independently from all other actors, including the UN Special Envoy. And since there are already, I mean, there are so many actors involved, why is it that you choose to work independently? And does that give you does it present opportunities to you? Does it give you an advantage?
It depends upon consent, huh? So you can only work with parties if they, and with anyone if they're willing to talk to you, and if they say, let's talk. And sometimes they'll say, we want you to work closely with the UN, and we do. We'll talk to them and explain the UN what we're doing, and the UN knows very well what we're doing and which parties we meet. I go from here to a meeting with the opposition, and that's all known. And but sometimes the parties are very happy that they can see that this is a separate bunch making their own decisions, working with them about whatever it is that they're trying to achieve. So it means that you aren't necessarily seen as being completely tied to a process, which might be problematic. Now, it's less obvious in Syria, but in a number of other places, it's been really important to be separate from it. Currently, we're working very closely with the UN in Libya. Previously, less so, because the Libyan process was taking a particular direction that we felt needed to be. It was an experiment, an attempt to build something quickly with the very barest of consent, and it failed. And so we left that on its own. And so, yes, independence is important as part of also building trust. It's crucial. HD is funded by states to do stuff, but isn't funded by states to be on contract for it. And so it's also important that we're not only independent from the UN, but also from states and of course from parties themselves. That said, by the simple fact of having to work closely with groups, inevitably means that some people are nervous outside, certainly the opponents, that you're too close to that group. And that's what trust requires, but it has its risks too, because governments can be very nervous if you're meeting their rebels and they don't know about it.
That was actually my other question, that you said that you work discreetly, but with all parties to the conflict. Do all parties to the conflict accept that, so that you work with everyone?
It has to be built. Eventually, yes. In structural terms, in each place, it depends. So in one area, it may be that the government says, we don't need your help, but meet the parties. That's fine, as long as you tell us. In other areas, and so in some areas, we just simply won't work with the government. And the opposition will know that we're only working with it in order to help it prepare for a political process. Always the goal is to climb that vertical axis, and always is to work with them to say there must be ways of doing this which are not on your horizontal axis, and it requires the parties to agree to that. So how precisely you work with who? Mediation is very complex. So sometimes all you're doing is preparing one group just to do something. It isn't always that you're working with all sides and you're sort of acting like a conductor. You might be, at one point you might be a violinist, at another point you might be cleaning the shoes of the conductor. It depends upon the role that the parties are wanting you to do, and whether or not you have a theory of change as to how that might help you climb up the vertical axis on that simple graph.
Thank you. Tahir, would you like to come back up here? I know that we don't have much time left. I hope it's all right with you if we
course.
take a few extra minutes. I mean, I had prepared some questions, but I really want to let you to give the opportunity to the audience to ask questions, and it would be great to get questions that are for both Andrew and Tahir. So sort of get into a more comparative discussion. Do we have any questions? Yes? I will repeat the question afterwards because this one is wired. So.
My name is Bo Elding, and I have one cynical but fairly easy top-to-down question for you regarding Syria. I've never been to Syria. I'm not an expert on Syria. What do you think stops Mr. Putin, who has conquered everybody here? Is the big victim of the whole situation, the domination situation, and even the US admits to admit now that should go into Syria and remedy the situation and let Putin off with the costs that's already had for bombing the country and supporting Assad.
Do you want to repeat that?
I don't think I can repeat the full question.
Okay, so
but the question is about the role of Putin in Syrian conflict.
So Russia, having invested a lot in protecting the government from collapsing. The time the Russians intervened was the peak of the war. ISIS was really rising and quickly taking over the country, and the government looked as if it was about to fall militarily. But the forces that were now likely to be competing were no longer just democratic forces from the street. There was this now complex set of forces which included jihadis, two major groups, and it looked as if it might reproduce another Libya. In other words, a collapse of the central state and lots of militia and so on. So Russia intervened to say, at the request of the government, to say we're going to prevent this government from falling, and it's a sort of state-building exercise. So. The core to your question, I think, is why would Russia now help fix this, as opposed to just walk away and say we've protected it from collapsing and it's now up to everyone else. I think it's a crucial question, and of course nobody knows, and it's just a personal analytical answer. I think there is a value in trying to say it's necessary to go far enough up that vertical axis such that there's something stable can emerge, because otherwise whatever is going to follow is going to be so unstable that it might either return to the conflict and therefore jeopardize the core Russian interests in the area, which are its military bases and naval bases, and the sense that it's a major global power, the sense that it's contributed to a major global concern, which is part of the whole ISIS thing, because the whole ISIS thing became the core part of its response, saying we're really intervening to protect against terrorism, and so in that regard we in America and the rest of the world stand together against terrorists. And so it's seen Russia repositioned as a major player in the Middle East, as a major player against terrorism, as a major player internationally, and been taken seriously again, and as a contributor to peace, partly for domestic purposes, in terms of the elections next year in Russia, but partly it seems to me also that as a significant player, it wants to get a tidy picture that's reasonably durable. And that requires going up that vertical axis. It requires not just stopping the war, it requires going up and getting some kind of a reasonably just outcome. And So I think in that regard, Russia's pushing for that. How exactly it will work is not clear. It's complicated. It's tried various things, and I think Russia's stuck, which is one of the reasons why it's hoping that something will come out of Geneva, or Sochi, or Astana. They're all possibilities.
I have a question about the possibility to build peace from the bottom up, because both these conflicts, we talk about major powers, Russia, India, Pakistan, UN, US, and so on. But in the meanwhile, we talk about the people within the conflict. And you said, Andrew, that the Syrians are ready to discuss peace. And in Kashmir, you also have this this talk getting started. And I was wondering, is it possible to create this social contract, like from the bottom up? And how far can you go in the peace process from the bottom up before you need the state, the political level as well, to recall that that the people really want things?
May I just add to that? And can you do it from outside? Can you do it as outside an institution?
So the two part.
So the question is about building peace from the bottom up, possibilities for that, and also from coming from the outside and doing that.
Shall I say something first?
Please, yeah. Please, yeah.
I think the answer in terms of bottom-up approaches is that I see these things, the social contract, as a sort of multiple level set of arrangements by which people agree to solve things peacefully and can discuss and work out some form of arrangements. Now, I don't think that it's possible, exactly as you say, to solve everything in that regard, but it's possible to solve some things. And in that multiple mosaic, the question is, if you don't do any of it, then people still retain suspicion and so on at the grassroots level. If you think that you can do everything at that level, then you're likely to be disappointed. So there's always limits to it. And so sometimes you can keep the process going up in some places, and it can keep building, and it can persuade the leaders. That's your theory of change, that eventually the population will say to the leaders, look, come on, this is ridiculous. And some of what I see in Kashmir was an attempt to do that, just to say the normalization of affairs will eventually, and trade and commerce will eventually persuade people, look, there's not such a big security risk, and maybe we can do it. So sometimes that can be a persuasive factor bottom up, but in the end it does require the key people with the core decisions to agree, and how you get there precisely in what order. So bottom up is useful, can be important, can be very important for people, can be very practical, but it does depend upon going further up. And can you do it from the outside? Of course, these agreements belong to the people, and they're the ones that reach them. All you're doing from the outside is trying to help the processes happen. And if people are willing to let you to do that, then you try. And if they think it's useful, they say keep on doing it. But it's their agreements. You're the facilitator of helping it to happen. The key is that the formula I use is that people might get places where they would never have got, and agreements that they would never have got without an intervention, but they're still their agreements. In other words, the intervention helped them get there, but they're theirs. And often happens in a process whereby you may have written a draft, you may have helped, you may have done all sorts of things, but nobody cares that you had anything to do with it. If it becomes theirs, it's theirs. And it's like trying to remember exactly who is the midwife. I mean, actually it's the child that's important, and the mother, and sometimes the father.
Tahir?
Yeah. No, thank you, Andrew. I don't think I can add much, but in terms of bottom up, and even in terms of the external and internal, my sense is that it's never a linear kind of a process that you start with bottom up and then you reach there. it kind of goes in all directions. And like Andrew said, I think the approach that you have to have somewhere to enter the system, and it depends on the conflict system and what is internal, what is bottom up, and what is kind of the other layer of decision making or influence. In Kashmir, for example, the idea that the exclusion of Kashmiri voices or people and political parties was a significant thing, a hurdle that emerged as a significant actor, because at times when India and Pakistan, like I said, in 66 and in 72 and even later on made those agreements, it didn't work out. And one of the things was the Kashmiris were saying, we don't accept this divide, we don't accept the ceasefire line or the line of control, and it's about us, and it's not just only about India and Pakistan. So there was something quite significant missing, and that does not mean that that is the only missing part. You might get that right, but in the meantime the other things trigger, and life is complicated. So there's no linear approach there, but I think the idea is that if you enter within that system, there has to be kind of multiple things and that need to happen, and often it's also a matter of capacity, it's also a matter of so many other things, resources and consent, primarily who wants to engage with you. And often it's not that straightforward. The governments don't necessarily want certain political voices to be part of the sort of negotiations, and so idea is quite of a incremental approach, and there are certain things, if you do them, shift things on the ground level, that creates a different possibility or a different horizon for people to see something that is in a particular moment missing from the scene. And it's like, it's one step forward and maybe 10 steps backward. And also in the similar vein, I think the external sometimes there's the hope is that these are also not necessarily very categorically clear distinctions, what is external and what is internal. Externally, yes, there are many limitations. You will always remain external. But the problem is that internally people are also very much entrenched into things, and they are not able to do things. So in Kashmir, for example, you can have very well-meaning people, but they are party to the things, and they are seen as somebody who is very much aligned with a particular position. So they are not able to transcend or mediate without external support. So I think, these things remain as a challenge, but not the challenges that are insurmountable. But these different layers, of course, become very much a hindrance. And in Kashmir's case, like, we realized that just bottom-up approach would not necessarily mean we needed to. So we kind of moved, didn't shift our focus, stayed very much focused in terms of the Kashmir, but included Indian and Pakistani kind of conversations and issues as part of that process, because it then runs into this kind of something happening here, but not having any impact there, then it remains very much vulnerable to sort of bigger things.
I was just going to say, illustratively, in terms of linear process, if you think of that graph, it's more like the sort of the line that ends up through a series of points that have been plotted. In other words, if you actually were to follow it, it might go like this, but hopefully across a century you'll see a line that goes through which is broadly going up there. It's never going to be a straight line in terms of going there, and which means, for me at least, but at least if there's a coherent connection between them, you're enabling things that the parties might not have done without an external intervener. But in the end, it has to be their social contract, because it's a little bit like the problem with the Syrian one, and I think this would come back to the social contract they got given to the Syrians was one agreed by 4 international parties. And the Syrians didn't discuss it. And so in the end, that's extremely difficult to make stick because they didn't consent to it. And it's the same thing in Yemen. In Yemen, the United Nations said the people who have invaded the capital must leave, go back, and then we'll continue with the transition that was in place. Now, that's not a recipe for peace. It's saying go back or else. It's a recipe for war. And because you have to force them to go back if they disagree. So in this, and an outside person, you can't impose it or can't impose it by force, and needs consent. And so I'm not quite sure whether or not we'll ever get this perfectly right. But when it works, local ownership is the only thing that counts, and the other, whoever has helped, who cares? It's largely irrelevant, and that's where it should be.
Do we have a last question? No?
I maybe have a last question.
Otherwise, I'll have a last question. Yeah, okay. Now, I just wanted to make a connection to Sweden and to Swedish politics, because the Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs, Margot Wallström, she wrote an article a few months back with the headline, "Mediation is the most powerful tool for peace." And do you think it's possible, I mean, in relation to Kashmir and to Syria, to name one tool that is the most powerful or the most important one?
Would you like to go first?
I mean, as a construct, no, I don't think it is possible to name one thing, but it may be possible in terms of the conversation evolving and understanding sort of mediation from a different perspective. So, for example, mediation itself is a contested word in Kashmir, and India explicitly has a position of saying no mediation whatsoever. And Kashmir is an internal word. Mediation would mean it's an international conflict. So, but what mediation can mean, what Andrew was talking about, is completely, a different detail. And once we talk to even people from within India and policymakers, they value that. So, so how the loaded kind of ness of a word can also create a different hurdle or opportunity. It just depends. So in Kashmir, I'm kind of struggling to think about what I think it would be local meaning Indians, Pakistanis included within that ownership that would ultimately make a social construct. Otherwise, externally you can have, on Kashmir we have about 60 plus very brilliant solutions articulated, spelled out, but they didn't work because there was no political process to do them. So I think ultimately it will have to be a local social kind of that local social contract, locally owned might be the word that I would go for mediation.
If I may make 2 responses to her comments. And the first is that one of the things that's extremely interesting to watch in this field is that peace, in the sense of that horizontal level in my simple graph, in the sense of ending the war, is not enough. And that in order to climb up that, part of what you've got to do is to say to the society as a whole, what kind of balance are you going to want between everyone in the society, and who's going to reach those agreements, and so on. Which brings in the question of rebuilding not just the contracts to deal with competition for power, but the questions about the social contract too, in the broadest sense, and particularly the role of women. And what's interesting for me in terms of that is that in terms of core technique, is that rebuilding the place of women in these societies, refinding a place for them to be safe, requires their consent too. And so, and building, it might require the primary consent of the forces to end the war on the horizontal axis, but climbing up the vertical axis needs more, and needs all of the people in the society. And one of the things that's particularly becoming a prominent feature, in my view, of this whole field is the attempt to try and find ways of building the full components of who's been involved in the conflict and who's suffered, and the full components of who's going to be involved in rebuilding the new sets of rules. And that critically includes a gender question. So in addition to mediation being a key part of peace, one of the things I think that Sweden, and she in particular, have put on the agenda, if I understand it, is saying we want a place where everyone is safe, not just where the men with guns are safe. And that includes a key role of women in any peace building or in any mediation exercise. So that, for me, is also particularly important. And by the way, it's a subject we haven't talked on. I've sort of done big picture questions, but it is something that I think is crucial for us to understand what kind of Syria might emerge from this, because the hopes that emerged in 2011 across the whole of the Arab Spring weren't only just hopes for a freer society for men. There were hopes for a freer society for the whole society. And it'll be interesting to see if Tunisia certainly has made major stages, and it'll be interesting to see if Syria can get out of that some kind of a just society for all of its people.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming here and for your interesting presentations. And I'm sorry for running a bit late with this. Thank you.